Hello and welcome to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I'm joined now by David Taylor-Smith from Aggreko. And David, thank you for making the time to be here. One of the things I wanted to, well, there are a couple of themes I'd like to explore with you, but one of the themes that was coming through, people sat in the chair the last 2 days, is this notion that renewables are on the rise, and the other thing is that this idea of decentralized power or distributed energy, whatever vernacular you want to put on it, is the way that Africa is going to accelerate its power delivery in some areas. And the third thing, and I'm playing a role of sort of kind of summarizing what's happened over the last 2 days, is that there's belief that solar has reached grid parity, for want of a better word. So what's your view on that trend? If I can give you the job of an analyst for a second, how would you see that?
Yep. Yeah. So you're right. I think if we're going to sit here in a year's time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we are going to see the rise of renewables. And I think the really interesting difference between big developed economies, say in Northern Europe and in Africa, is in Northern Europe they're doing large grid applications, and they're doing that in order to meet international protocols, Kyoto protocols and commitments. If you look at the applications and opportunities in Africa, I think it gives a fantastic opportunity at a household level where you don't have access to power, reliable power, that you have the ability to generate some power for domestic consumption, which I think is a really interesting possibility.
It's that immediate need of, in rural and in village areas. And
so if less than 4 out of 10 people in Africa have access to power, it offers a real opportunity if you're 100 kilometers from the nearest grid, that you could get cheap sources of power. So I think that is really interesting. I think the economics of them, where you aggregate it at a grid level, are quite challenging. If you look in Northern Europe, well, that would suggest that you cannot produce power at parity to other sources without substantial government incentives. And few countries in Africa, Morocco, South Africa, are looking at large grid power applications. But actually most other places, I think the opportunities around off-grid, I think there's fantastic opportunities which are already being exploited for off-grid applications like telecoms. If you have remote mast networks, the opportunity to use combinations of solar, battery hybrid, and traditional high-speed engine in combination offers really interesting economic advantages, because you can run different sources at different times of the day to match customer demand and also what's happening with the sun.
And you can reduce some of the maintenance costs and things like that as well, because by offsetting the fact that your generator isn't running at full pelt all the time, and things like that. But where do you see how do you see? Because one of the other conversations is talking about is this notion of blended power, whereby more and more people are sort of saying, well, actually, what we need to do is we shouldn't look at renewables as we've got a renewable power plant and so on. We got to look at it all as a blended notion. Do you think a company like Aggreko has a role to play within that mix as well?
Well, I think there's two bits to your question there. If you look at the banking system and you look at how Africa's responded compared to developed markets in banking, I think power is quite similar. So, where you don't have fixed telephone networks, or like where you don't have grid networks, you end up with different banking systems. And I think where there are lack of grid infrastructure, this offers an opportunity to put in place distributed power at all sorts of level, at a household level, at a company level, at a mine, And then at a grid level. At the grid level, I'm less convinced about at the moment because of the economics. I mean, where's the role for companies like Aggreko? Well, I mean, we have supported wind power, onshore and offshore, in developed markets and developing markets. They're the same companies doing the developments, and we've done offshore applications where we've helped during the commissioning phase. And then you also need to have a certain level of power off-grid during downtimes and maintenance. So, yeah, I mean, we've become a critical part of that industry in a number of countries around the world. We can see some interesting applications for telecoms, where there's during the construction phase and then during the running phase of having these hybrid off-grid power systems, we can do that. Also, in particularly at the moment, in certain companies have cash constraints, and where you've got a cash constraint and you can't afford the upfront capital cost, so like a mine, in the early life cycle of a mine, there's good opportunities to do a rental solution around that and not a permanent power solution. And then actually as the mine evolves and they generate cash, well then they can throw off cash and they can put in a permanent power plant. But what I'd also say is, I mean, a lot of these technologies, they're beyond embryonic and they're being commercialized. But I am quite sure, if you look at the evolution of hybrid battery systems, what we see today is so advanced from what we saw 5 years ago, and what we'll see in 5 years' time will be much more advanced than what we see today. And if you remember a couple of months ago, Tesla announcing the household battery pack, I mean, that's a really interesting taste of the future, where you can see the economics and the functionality of those type of battery systems really being game changing.
And that's where, you know, solar and battery, they kind of follow a different DNA, you know, something similar to Moore's law, where, you know, every 5 years they get more efficient, and at some point it will hit a tipping point. Now, well, you know, one of the other things, David, that was coming through over the last 2 days, which I'd like to get your view on, is, you know, so there was an acceptance about this notion of decentralized power. But then there was also an acceptance or a query around the fact that, okay, how do you fund these smaller projects? You know, and what's your take on that? Because there were a number of solutions offered, which I wasn't quite convinced about. But you know, again, I'll let you talk. But what's your view on how you can fund these smaller installations?
So I think there's been, if you look at a 10-year time frame for Africa, there's been a revolution in funding. You know, there are around 120 commissioned IPPs or licensed, of which about half were actually commissioned. And if you look 10 years ago, that the sources of funding were typically IFC, World Bank related, with the need to give kind of sovereign bank guarantees, and those were mainly centralized power systems. And if you look at the evolution now, it's highly fragmented. And actually coming with fragmented is size and funding models. And you have funding models ranging from traditional banks, still with the IFC, through to private, through to public-private partnerships, through to EPC contractors doing it as part of an EPC solution. So that variety means that there is more variety in access to financing options, which will mean there's more options on what gets put on the ground in terms of final package solutions.
So what you're saying is that there's just a load more actors involved now. So
exactly.
You know, there are all these different levels. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is which is interesting in some way, because not many people have kind of remarked on it, is the whole DNA of what's happening in the oil and gas markets. Now, we've had a couple of comments about people saying, oh, well, okay, it's, you know, de-risking, we de-risk the oil and gas prices. But one of the interesting things that I picked up on when we were talking off air is, you know, your notion, well, actually, it's bigger than that. You know, what is the oil and gas market doing for some of the economies and the markets? So it'd be quite nice to get your view on that side of things as well.
So I think the oil and gas sector in Africa is a complete game changer. I mean, at the moment, there's some economic things happening because at a global level, the oil price having reduced from $120 down to 60 odd is creating some unusual dynamics with major producers, OPEC producers and shale players. Now, you can argue what's causing that. Now, that's having a ripple effect, and that ripple effect could be beneficial if you're an African government where you're using liquid fuels and the price of liquid fuels coming down, so there's a beneficial effect. But actually, if you came back to local politics and geology, it's really interesting what's happening in Africa. So if you look at the west coast of Africa, I mean, Nigeria long been dominated with an oil and gas sector. Right along the West Africa region now, there are major discoveries of oil and gas. You know, the Tullow field in Ghana is now producing gas and pumping it into Ghana and landed on shore 7 or 8 months ago. Gas is arriving in Dar es Salaam. There's the gas fields in Mozambique which have been producing foundation gas with more gas to come. And I think those are going to revolutionize those economies. You can see what's happening in Angola, what a transformative effect it's had. So for those countries, their economies are going to change. And for those countries, their ability to start exporting energy in the form of either oil and gas or power from that oil and gas is going to transform the energy map of Africa.
And picking up on that, because again, one of the other narratives coming through is, which I personally found interesting, because you know, in the last 2 years at AEF, you know, we seem to meet once a year, but you know, when we've met, there's been this dominance around, okay, we've got to generate power, we've got to generate power, we've got to generate power. One of the other interesting things that's come in is that, you know, there's much more of a narrative around, okay, well, that's kind of all well and good, but we're now also recognizing the fact that we need to build the transmission network.
That's right.
Around, and the distribution network to evacuate this, that power. And so how are you seeing that conversation playing out?
Yep.
You know, in the African context. Again, you know, you mentioned these economies that they can now export power, but you know, do you think we're lagging behind on that infrastructure a little bit?
Well, I think the analogies, let me use instead of banking this time like the telephone network. So if you look at, Africa's effectively managed to leap over the first 80 years of the telecoms sector, requiring fixed line infrastructure. And I think power's quite similar. That what you'll end up with is this much more evolved model where you've got distributed power and you've got power being produced at a household level, and you'll have grid power. And that doesn't look anything like Germany. And I think that's because you can jump over 3 or 4 evolutions because of technology. So you'll get, I think, a combination of domestically produced power, because you know, people want to access power for their own consumption at home, and you could see that coming through solar. You'll get local distributed power because you're a mining company and you're off grid and there's no prospects of being on the grid, and you want to economically produce power for economic activity. And then you'll have network power, where countries are looking for the efficiencies of building networks so they can build centralized or regionalized generation that can provide power to a whole country or a region.
And just as we're coming to the end of our time here today, what's the outlook in your view for the sort of, you know, more temporary power sector and things like that, which, you know, it's not all you guys do, but the Aggreko name is aligned to. How do you see that sector playing a role in, you know, what you've just described?
Yep. So I think, if you strip down what we do at the most basic level, there's 2 or 3 aspects that make it very unique. So firstly is it's all on our balance sheet. So all that complications, I'm sure you've had finances sit here and say, look, it's as complex to do a 20-year 1 billion as it is to do a 5-year 20 million. So all that complexity disappears because we'll do it on our balance sheet. So it's instantly available. So speed available on our balance sheet will still remain constants. And I think the interesting possibility for us is the emergence of some new technologies and our ability to use our balance sheet and use those assets in multiple locations. So instead of charging the asset cost to one customer, you charge the asset cost across 5 or 6 customers on 5 or 6 occasions.
Right.
Some of the technology will allow us to get closer to the cost of permanent power. So I can see us moving up and starting to nibble in to permanent power markets.
So to use the technology term, you're moving up the stack, or depending on where you think you are in the stack. And what are those technologies?
Well, some of them I'm not prepared to talk about.
Right.
But I would hazard a guess we'll be sitting here next year talking about them. But we've got some in development, some game changers, I think. And game changers looks like the possibility of expanding market, and that will be at the expense of some permanent power solutions today, where we can offer all the economic benefits of that with no complications of financing
and the speed of delivery.
Very quick speed of delivery and quick flexibility, saying if you want 50 megawatts today and 100 megawatts in 6 months and back down to 50, that you can scale up. Because a lot of the conversations we have with ministers in this room, where if you're a traditional large power provider and you want to look at a 15, 20-year commitment, I mean, some of the countries here today have been in existence for 40 years. So to actually ask a minister to predict what power consumption they want in another 20 years is very difficult.
It's close to impossible, right?
It's close to impossible. So I think the neat thing is, particularly if we get these other technologies right, at the right pricing points, is they don't have to do that. They can guess for 3 years or 5 years, and then they can keep changing it.
And then I think also that there is a very complementary role with, depending on what type of power mix, a country or whatever want to pursue. If you're going to say, okay, well, we're going to have more solar, we're going to have more wind, whatever. We all know the issues with that type of power. It goes up and down like a yo-yo, right? So you need something to kind of balance that out, so that you get some sort of something closer to a baseload profile.
Yeah. Don't forget, yo-yos are different. Some yo-yos are like this. If you're in the North Sea, the yo-yos can be nothing, and then it's not really a yo-yo in the North Sea. If it doesn't blow for a month, you don't get anything. But in the Sahara it's going to be sunny every day mostly.
Well, it depends on who's playing with the yo-yo as well. Well, David, listen, it's been a pleasure as always. We've kind of come to the end of our time here. Thank you again for watching. This has been another interview with AEF TV and Engerati. I hope you enjoyed this interview. There are many more on our website. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.